Short story by Paul McCann, The Scrounger. As a young lad, Joe joined the Signal Corps in the British Army. With a high IQ and desire for danger, it wasn't long before Joe was selected for officer school. He soon achieved the rank of captain in the infantry, and at 21 he had enough guts to take on the whole world. But he soon learned there were special privileges as well for being an officer. While enjoying the great food and conversation with other officers in the mess room, there was always something missing though, for he wanted to be much more involved with the war effort. Eventually he proposed an idea to some of his fellow officers. The idea was to put forward himself towards the underground and British intelligence, and after some brief communication he was accepted. Europe was full of intrigue for Joe. He had linguistic skills in French and German, and soon opened up a place for himself in the underground movement, selling goods on the black market. With the Royal Signal Corps, Joe went in, but then he was on his own. Eventually he made himself a known identity on the black market. World War II was in progress, and it was easy for Joe to get around Europe. His networking between his list of contacts was growing. He was good at what he did. He set up a European taxi service, and with the British Army, he was able to call on jeeps, motorbikes with a sidecar, and even a tank if he wanted one. He could be at any place at any time. Yes, his multilingual abilities were used to full advantage. While selling goods to German officers, he had overheard conversations and was able to pass on vital information back to intelligence and the group leaders in the French underground movement. Joe sat around often in pubs, commanding his hawker's license around the quiet corners of Europe. He was a popular man with the troops on both sides. While he was able to bring back invaluable information for the British, he was also able to please the German officers with a regular supply of rare items on the black market. After a good track record with his customers, Joe found a new demand to provide goods for very important people in Berlin. News arrived in the shape of a weekly order list, which also provided him with secret roads in and out to the German army network. Joe instantly gained the trust of elite members of the officer ranks in Germany, and now supplied with his own car and driver by the Germans, Joe brought them cases of cognac as well as chocolates and cigarettes. At the same time, Joe provided the British Army daily movements of German officers and some places of interest where they would be gathering. One of the most popular places for German officers was a night spot in Berlin, where they would often meet to discuss plans. One of their weaknesses, of course, was French cognac, and Joe was able to provide that quite often when needed. Ironically, it was with the help of the wild geese in the French underground that Joe had a regular supply of that particular item. He was very often now busy on the road, collecting goods and information that he lost touch with what he was actually doing during the war. His black market business was booming. One evening, Joe and his driver were at the Dutch frontier waiting for a truck load of cognac to arrive. As the truck pulled in, Joe gave the driver the nod and the truck parked on the shoulder of the road. Joe spoke in German, and he told the driver of the car to wait. He also told the truck driver to start unloading the cognac. The road was empty of traffic. Suddenly a thick fog dusted the frontier as the dumb-looking truck driver started to unload the cognac off the truck. Joe was taken by surprise. The man that stepped out of the car produced a gun and held it to Joseph's face and demanded the cognac be put in the car. Suddenly another car pulled up. It had a small group of French mercenaries who knew Joe well and could see he was having a problem with a German officer. They quickly took the situation into control and answered sharply with a volley of shots from semi-automatics that they carried under their arm. The German officer fell to the ground, bleeding heavily. Joe went and thanked the French underground soldiers and thanked them for all of the things that they were doing together during the war effort. They knew Joe as a British Army officer working with the black market. They knew him as an intelligence officer, and they had great respect for him. The truck driver was standing there and hadn't got a clue what had just happened. But the delivery had been made to Joe, and Joe gave his friends in the French underground half of the delivery. The mercenaries quickly put it in their car, and Joe put his half into the German officer's car, and the truck driver was paid, and they all went their separate ways. Along the way, on the road, Joe was heading to Belgium. He quickly gave a wave to the checkpoints as he went through, and at one of the points when Joe was pulled and asked for identification, Joe had provided the list of German officers who the cognac was going towards. He was given permission at each checkpoint to continue his journey. After a while, Joe pulled into a small pub in Belgium. With a few words to the Flemish officers there, he was permitted entrance to the pub where he was to meet up with the German officers. He walked into the pub and sat down, and they muttered amongst themselves for a while. Joe made a point about taking back an extra bottle of cognac for his wife back in France. One of the German officers didn't like that. Joe didn't give him time to make up his mind. He winked at the German officer. The German officer winked back. And before the German officer could lift his weapon, one by one, Joe produced a Waltner PPK and shot each of the officers where they sat. Joe had just managed to miss 3 bullets that just passed by his ear, and the other officers that he had shot lay on the ground. Joe then decided to smash up the pub. He was starting to lose it. It was all just too much for him. He picked up one of the German officer's semi-automatic machine guns and sprayed the entire pub, shooting every glass, every bottle, every table, and with the rapid bursts from his semi-automatic, he even shot the publican. After the bloodbath that eventuated, he stood there, looking all around him, not even realizing what had just happened. What have I done? He thought. This is a hell of a place that I'm in. He demonstrated for the first time not just his frustration with the war, but his ability to do nothing about it, but crack under the pressures of his job. There was never anyone to give a debriefing counsel to, no one to hear how he felt, no counselling, for he was on his own. sat there in the pub for a day, for a week, could have been a month as far as he was concerned, drinking all of the French cognac that he had brought there for the German officers. He could hardly believe it when, out of the blue one day, 2 British Army soldiers walked into the pub and found Joe on the floor, still half stocious drunk. They told him that the news of the war that had finished 2 weeks ago. Joe could hardly believe it. He asked for some proof. One of the officers, who was a communications officer, produced a radio, and a message was sent, and the relay message back from the infantry battle station to Joseph was that, yes indeed, the Allies had taken control in Berlin. Joe spoke to the commanding officer, and he asked for the rest of the details on just what had happened. The person on the other end of the receiver told of the Normandy landing and the battle that had ensued. After a while, Joe and the officer signed off communication, and it wasn't long until Joe not only broke another back of a bottle of cognac on the floor, but he also found some vodka and gin, and of course other liqueurs that were in the cellar of the pub that he had been staying for the past 2 weeks. Joe and the 2 English officers sat there, and whatever they had, or whatever it was, they sat there and they drank, and they celebrated the end of the war. They were joined about 2 days later by some French renegades. They also sat there and they drank for quite a long time, celebrating the end of the war. Before they all left, Joe managed to pack a few kegs from the pub into the jeep that was given to him by the 2 British officers. Most of these were sold on the black market. Eventually, one by one, there was a lot of transactions being made apart from jeeps and whiskey and alcohol and cigarettes. There was even some vehicles being sold. So Joe's business was still booming for a while, and he enjoyed trading on the black market, even though the war was officially over. During the war, Joe had made quite a good living for himself. Sometimes these things happen during terrible times in life. Something good always eventuates, and Joe had a good little business. There was a recession on, but Joe had never cared for it, because his business was going quite well. He had lots of scams happening all over Europe. One of his great little innovations were collecting empty tank shells for the German scrap metal market. And these rare, large tank shells were rare pieces that he had copied and passed on as authentics to dealers who had made ice trays and little ornaments for people's homes, which were passed off as relics of World War II. Joe had kept the real McCoys himself. He was no dozer. Eventually, Joe had decided it was time to return, time to go back to England. Did he want to go back to England? That's what he was wanting to go through in his own mind. Brussels will probably take him somewhere else in his life, with the dolly birds and the artists that he had got to know. Indeed, Joe was a talented man himself. And after a while, sitting with the Yanks, drinking and socialising, there was a loose kind of community that was drifting in and out around Brussels. He went to France for a while, and he sat talking to the Bohemian district people. And with the situation in Europe, it was becoming more difficult to actually look back in London and to return to the place of his birth. But eventually he knew he had to, for he had a wife back there and 2 children. So he began a slow journey back to England. A very slow journey. Finally he returned to his hometown. But he found it a cold place to come back to, because he kept thinking about his wild frolics during the war. And he wondered what he could do with himself now that he was a civilian. The years passed by with a variety of things for him to do. He became an architect, and he tried even to open up a business selling second-hand goods. It was good for a while, but mostly bad. Joe could never really adapt to the civilian life that he now found himself in, and so in the end there was no choice. He had to escape from it. He knew back in Europe he had hidden away in places art treasures and little pieces of plaque and plunk and pluck that he had found over the years. And he knew that he could probably open up a business back there and possibly even an art studio of his own. He eventually started to paint at a small studio that he opened up in Paris, and there he remained until he died. The end.